2023.
Woo!
My name's Rory Anderson. I am a member of the Socialist Worker Party in Glasgow and I'll be chairing this meeting. Just so you know how it runs, if you've never been to one before, we'll have someone doing an introduction for about 30 minutes. Then you'll have some 2 to 3 minutes to discuss amongst yourselves. Then we'll have a period of time to ask questions, make contributions before our speaker comes back. So this meeting is Marxism in 30 minutes, and our speaker today is Jess, Walsh, who works in the trade union office for the Socialist Workers Party and is a member of the Central Committee.
Take it. Wonderful. Thanks so much. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here for the first session. I have to say that the idea of trying to give a coherent introduction to Marxism in 30 minutes is somewhat overwhelming, but I take some solace in the fact that it's actually Marxism over 4 days, isn't it? And a lot of the topics I'll be kind of introducing. There'll be a chance to explore in other meetings, from the economics course that is on Sunday afternoon to the dialectic, historical materialism. I've just been having a fascinating discussion about the Russian Revolution. There's a whole course about the Russian Revolution, I think on Saturday, or is it Friday? Friday in the Walsh Den, so people should look out for that. So, here to discuss the ideas of Karl Marx, obviously an enormous figure and a controversial figure, you know, still well over 100 years after his death. So I guess, why do his ideas persist? Why do we think they are worth defending? Having a whole festival dedicated to his ideas, and why do we think they're worth building on? And I think we should start with saying he's one of the very few people in history who's fundamentally changed the way we look at the world, right? His ideas have changed the way we look at politics, the way we looked at economics, history, philosophy, science. And I think to look around the world at the moment in 2023, the tools that he's given us from Marxism have an immense usefulness in making sense of the crisis-ridden world that we find ourselves in. His ability to explain the motions of the capitalist system and his understanding of it really as a uniquely destructive and exploitative system absolutely line up with what we see if we look around the world. So what I want to argue really is that the ideas of Karl Marx, you know, far from being out of date, you know, who's someone who was writing and living about, 150 years ago, far from them being out of date, I think they were incredibly far-sighted, right? And offer us a clarity to understand our world, and not just a clarity to understand the world, but a toolkit for fighting for something new, right? And I think these ideas are more essential than they've ever been, right? As the capitalist system, the world around us, enters, deeper and deeper series of crises. And the scale of destruction that we see is now as existential, right? The climate crisis is no longer just a far off thing we have to worry about years, decades away. It has arrived, right? Extreme weather is now a terrifying normality of the world we live in. From the wildfires that we saw across North America that, you saw those horrifying dystopic images of New York covered in smoke, the deadly floods in May. These are just things that seem to be becoming the normality for us. And, to be clear, catastrophic climate change is just one part of the destruction of our natural world by the capitalist system, by the economic system that we live under, really driven by the system's rapacious appetite for profits. Not just climate crisis, economic crisis has been here to stay for 15 years now, bearing down, since the great financial crisis in 2007, bearing down on working class living standards here and around the world. And that the cost of living crisis is really just the sharpest and latest expression of this crisis. So we have to say the capitalist system cannot even reproduce itself by its own standards anymore. It cannot produce growth. And as always, working class people are expected to pay the price for the failure of the system and bail out the system for the people at the top. So I think we should say that if Marx were alive today, he would be fuming at the state of the world, right? And I think, the caricature of Karl Marx is kind of a dusty, beardy old man who was poring over tomes in the British Library is only half true. He did pore over books in the British Library. But he studied capitalism because he was angry and he was an activist and he was a revolutionary and he wanted to see an end to this horrific system that we live under. I've already mentioned the climate and economic crises. We're also the closest to nuclear war than we have been at any time since the end of the Cold War, driven above all by capitalist inter-imperialist rivalries. And there's a series of meetings about this across the weekend as well. Not only war, not only the crisis of war that threatens us, the horrors of racism and borders, with just in the last few weeks, hundreds of refugees being drowned, trying to reach safety in Europe. The ever-growing threat of the far right, now in government in Europe, in Italy, or, close to in France, the far right rearing its head as a threat again. But that's not the whole picture, is it? Because in the last year, we've also seen the return of class struggle to Britain after decades of record low levels of strikes. The undeniability of class antagonisms, so essential to Marxism, has resurfaced again after being hidden or masked. This is a very positive development, right? Because contained within class struggle for Marx is the keys for a new world. But I'll return to this later. Okay, so what is Marxism? It might be better to start with what Marxism isn't, right? It's not treating every word ever written by Karl Marx as the gospel truth. Learning it off by heart so that you can quote it. I think people should read Marx. His incredibly fertile writing that offers a lot to all of us. Is a very, incredibly rich ideas. And it's possible that you might hear some quotes from Marx in this meeting, but that's not really what it is to be a Marxist, just to repeat the phrases that Marx said. Being a Marxist is about using the method he developed to apply to an understanding of our world, so that we can understand better how to unroot it and get a new kind of society. Okay, so that's the beginning. And I think because it's not like a dogma, because we don't, treat everything that you said as the beginning and end of our understanding, Marxism is a body of thought that's been developed and built on since Marx's time. So, not just by Marx, he was worked closely with people like, his great collaborator, Friedrich Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto with, but it was developed by other revolutionaries, Russian revolutionaries, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Antonio Gramsci, and others. And I believe there are meetings on all these figures as well over the course of the weekend. I'm signposting lots of things for you to go to. These were great revolutionaries who made a big impact in their time, who used Marx's understanding of the world and his method to try and make sense of the situation that they found themselves in, to point a way forward. Okay, so where to begin? Where am I at time-wise? Great. Okay, so firstly, Marx was a materialist, right? He said that in order to understand any human society, you had to start with the material reality of those societies. How does that society produce the things it needs to survive? How does it produce the food, the shelter, etc.? What kind of technology did it use to produce these things? What is it able to produce? And how does it produce these things? And very importantly, what are the relationships around production that dictate how that society produces? Who is involved in the production process? And importantly, who makes decisions about it? Who controls production? Who owns it? And who benefits? These are key questions for him to understand these things. And we have to say this is in stark contrast to many historians of that time and up until now, right? He was arguing against what's called an idealist view of history. The idea that history is not driven by changes in material circumstances, but by the ideas in people's heads, right? That the ideas change, and that's how societies change. No, for Marx, he's very clear that people and their ideas are shaped by the actual circumstances they found themselves in, right? As Marx said, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. He was clear. It was also clear that humans are social beings, right? None of us can produce the things we need to survive on our own. The idea of a selfish individual, which is kind of, the capitalist idea of how human beings are, the selfish individual operating outside of society, doesn't exist. We need to cooperate to produce the things we need to survive. And we've done this since the beginning of human history. None of us can live separately from the rest of society. And when you look throughout history, humans have done this in an enormously varied amount of ways, right? And this has given rise to different societies with different ideas. And I think this is very important because I think even more now than in Marx's time, we're often given the impression that this is how society has always been, right? The capitalism is the beginning and the end, right? When in reality, society has been organized in lots of different ways, right? Which is hopeful for us, right? If we've lived in a different way in the past, we can live in a different way in the future, and that's quite important. So historical change is very important to Marx. He developed an approach known as historical materialism. To understand the past, that helps us understand today, you know, what processes helped capitalism emerge. Looking at the past can also show us or explain why change happens, what drives change, right? So for Marx, change is driven not by people changing their ideas so much, but by changes in the way that society organizes production, you know, technological change combined with the social relationships dictating how we produce things. So, for instance, the exploitative relationship that existed in feudalism between the serf and the lord, or a similarly exploitative relationship between a capitalist and a worker. And just as Marx didn't think that was ideas that drove change, neither did he think it was, you know, great men just operating and changing, you know, this idea of the great men of history. He famously said that men and women make history, but not in the circumstances of their own choosing, right? He actually saw history being primarily driven as a history of class struggle, which involved so-called ordinary people operating in the circumstances they found themselves in as agents of change. So famously, you may know the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. For Marx, it's the driver of historical change. That's very important. So he looked to history so as to understand what was unique about capitalism, where did it emerge from, and what are the key contradictions contained within capitalism. Okay, so what are those contradictions? So Marx's kind of method for finding these drivers, these motions of the capitalist system, the contradictions that I talked about, can be understood as looking beneath the surface appearance of capitalism, right? The motions of the system that push it forward. It's not sufficient to look at the surface appearance of the capitalist system to explain the actual reality. So he used a method of using abstract concepts and then testing them by using a method he called rising from the abstract to the concrete, i.e. the actual existing world. So capitalism on the surface appearance is extremely, extremely confusing, sometimes deliberately so, I would say. You know, the movement of the stock market seemingly out of control of any one person, the supposed free markets, the complex way that capitalism presents itself to us. And so he was looking beneath the surface appearance to see what were the drivers of it. So what he found, is that the capitalist system can be understood by looking at two key divisions contained within it, okay? So the first division, which I've already kind of touched upon, is that between the capitalist and the worker. And this is central to understanding capitalism. Capitalism is above all a class society where a tiny minority of people own and control what we call the means of production, i.e. the things we need to produce, the things that we need to survive, the factories, the land, the Amazon distribution warehouses, the call centers, etc. The division between those group of people who own all those things and the vast majority of us who own nothing except our ability to labor, which we have to sell to a capitalist in order to survive, right? And that class divide runs throughout society. And I think this is why, capitalism being a system based on freedom is completely laughable. Marx talked about workers being free in two senses under capitalism. We are free to, if we don't like our job, to quit and go and get another job. But we're also free from any access to any of the things we need to survive, the means of production. So therefore, we're free to starve if we do not enter into a relationship where we have to sell our labor to a capitalist. So the division between workers and capitalists is a division based on exploitation, whereby workers and capitalists have opposing material interests. And this is, as I said, based on exploitation. Capitalists need the labor of workers to produce the lifeblood, really, of the capitalist system, that is profits. And profits are the difference between the value of what a worker creates in their workplace, making commodities to be sold on the market, and the value of their wages that they take home at the end of the day. And this is very, very, very important, right? For Marx, human labor is the creator of value and of wealth, right? Exploitation is hidden under capitalism, right? You know, we hear the idea of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. This can never be true. This can never hold true under capitalism. There is no guarantee. In fact, there's a guarantee that it's not, that you value the value that you create at work is the same value that you take home at the end of the day. No, your wages have to contain a shortfall in that respect. This is the source of capitalism's profits, the difference between that. And it's important here to say that exploitation is not an anomaly under capitalism, that some workers are exploited, you know, and some are not. It is at the center of the system. Production only takes place under capitalism if a capitalist thinks they're going to make a profit, right? For Marx, profit is not a reward for capitalists being so clever and innovative and opening factories or investing in the first place, as some, you know, mainstream economists like to explain it. Profits are created by the robbery of workers of the value of their work. And you know, we see this, don't we? Capitalists are constantly trying to squeeze more out of us, aren't they? Making us work harder, making us work longer for less pay, greater intensity, faster, that kind of thing. And they do this not just because they're greedy bastards, although they, you know, they often are, but because the logic of the system dictates that they have to act in this way, right? Because if they don't race to squeeze profits out of their workers, they will fall behind their rivals, right? And that brings us to the second division, right? So there was two key divisions. So the second one now, the second division that exists is between individual capitalists and individual capitalist firms themselves, right? So while the division between workers and capitalists is very central, it's not the case that the capitalists are an entirely coherent and cooperative class, right? In fact, the exact opposite is true. You know, capitalists are united in exploiting workers, in trying to get as much out of us as they can, but they're also locked into competition with each other. They have to try and undercut each other in order to survive. Sorry, hold on. Okay, so capitalism is therefore a competitive system, right? Capitalists are engaged in a frenzy of trying to outcompete their rivals in order to grow. And if they don't do this, they'll fall behind and they will go out of business. So the system enforces a logic of its own. So the wealth they accrue from exploiting workers is then plowed back into bigger means of production so that they can compete better. So bigger factories, more advanced machinery, hiring more workers, bigger factories, the rest of it, enable them to extract more profits and stay ahead of their rivals. And this is what we call accumulation, right? And this is the second important law that tells us a lot about how capitalism works. It's what makes capitalism very specific and unique as an economic system. You will know that capitalism is not the first class society. I've already talked about one of the other ones. It's not the first society based on exploitation. But other systems had a limit on how much they could exploit from the lower class. Feudalism. So once a ruling class under feudalism had enough to have a luxurious lifestyle, that was kind of good. That was the limit for them. That was kind of the upper limit. Under capitalism, because there is this frenzy of competition, there exists no upper limit. In fact, you have to keep growing your wealth in order to and trying to grow your profits, or you will go out of business. In fact, the capitalist's own consumption isn't even really the goal of capitalism, right? It isn't really the object of production. It isn't the primary reason that capitalists engage in production. profits themselves are the object, that difference. And most of the surplus value, that's what the difference I talked about before between the value that's created by the worker and what they take home. Most of the surplus value that's squeezed out of workers isn't actually consumed by a capitalist. It's actually plowed back into production. It's reinvested. So they're compelled to do this, to accumulate more and more in order to survive. Okay, so a quote from Marx that underlines this compulsion to accumulate. He says that modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange of property, is a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production, is like a sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. So really what he's saying here is that the system is out of control of any one person, right? It is in many ways illogical and irrational. If we think about the climate crisis, you know, the climate change and fossil fuels under capitalism, even capitalists know that we're heading on a path to total destruction, right? Even fossil fuel executives are aware of this, right? Wonderful, thank you. But for them to waltz into a boardroom, a BP or Shell, and say we're not going to produce fossil fuels anymore is to stop acting like a capitalist, right? For a state to commit to doing this, it would put them at a competitive disadvantage. So the system enforces its own logic above any of our control. Capitalists have to fight to exploit us as much as they can, because if they don't, someone else will. Because if others are paying their workers less, they will soon be run out of business. So really, it's a race to the bottom. The productive ability of our society, right, is not decided by human need, but by a frenzy of competition and accumulation. And for that reason, it contains so many irrationalities, right? Enormous wealth combined alongside unimaginable misery and poverty. And because the system is so chaotic and frenzied and unplanned, it is inherently prone to crises of many, many kinds. So far from the lie, you know, there's a lie that's constantly sold to us, and that capitalism does, it means kind of steady, uninterrupted growth. That's not true. Capitalism does not tend towards steady and uninterrupted growth. Capitalism does not tend towards equilibrium. And because Marx saw capitalism this way, Marxist economists are actually much better able to predict crises in the economic system. You know, they're much better able to predict the great financial crisis and all the rest of it, whereas mainstream economists couldn't see it coming. They were taken completely by surprise by it. So even though Marx was exploring and writing about capitalism when it was still in its infancy in the 19th century, he could see that built into the system were these contradictions which would inevitably lead to crisis and instability. And I think really the evidence for all of this is the movement of the capitalist system in the time since his death. It has not been able to escape repeated crises of varying intensity from then until now. So the question is not if there will be a crisis, but when there will be one, right? And there are many drivers of crisis. And I think, you know, if you're interested in this, you should really think about doing the economics course on Sunday afternoon, which I've talked about this, which will go through this in much more detail than I'm going to have time to. One of them is overproduction, which is an interesting crisis, you know, in the chase for more profits, for new markets. Sometimes capitalists produce too much of something, and then it's thrown onto the scrap heap, and they can no longer sell their goods. They can no longer sell their goods for a profit. And very importantly, a big driver of crisis is a tendency within the system that is driven by the process of competitive accumulation itself. So the fight for profitability that drives, you know, the change, the advances in technology and stuff that we've seen, the rising productivity in the short term. In the long term, this undermines the rate of profit for the system as a whole. And we'll go into that more detail in the economics course. And this is a very, very big problem and another key contradiction. And it basically says that the very force that makes capitalism so dynamic and so able to grow so quickly, drive technological advancement like I've talked about, in the long term, it undermines the ability of the system as a whole to grow. And again, this is borne out in the evidence and the way that capitalism has developed. But, you know, this process of competitive accumulation has other consequences. That is that firms get bigger. They do this through you know, like we talked about, process of accumulation. You know, now we have giant multinationals, whereas in Marx's time, it would have been single kind of factories or textile mills, that kind of thing. And they grow on the one hand through investing in more and more capital, but also through merging, etc. This process of competition has led to capitalism actually expanding around the globe. During Marx's time, capitalism really only existed in a few Western cities. Now it is in every corner of the planet. And I think that means that the nature of competition means that war is completely embedded in capitalism as well. And so I think the central conclusion for Marx and the central conclusion for us has to be, if crisis is built into the system, if exploitation is built into the system, if war is built into the system, then the system cannot be reformed. It has to be pulled out by its root. We can't just tweak around the edges or bring in some law to make it slightly less exploitative or slightly less, any other reforms. We have to talk about getting rid of capitalism altogether, and that means revolutionary change. And I think that brings us to Marx's most important idea and really the central principle of Marxism. In fact, even if you weren't given 30 minutes to give a definition of Marxism, if you wanted to try for in one sentence, you could say that Marxism is the theory and practice of working class self-emancipation. Because the class division that drives down the center of the system means that, workers are exploited and they suffer. But exploitation is a relationship of mutual dependence, right? Workers need capitalists, like we talked about, to have access to the means of production so they can get their wages, the rest of it. But capitalists need workers as well. They cannot cream off the profits if they are not being made by the workers. Thank you so much. And this gives workers power. So Marx called the working class the grave diggers of capitalism, right? They were the force that could get rid of the system. Now, when Marx was writing, he was engaged with debates of other socialists they were called the utopian socialists. They could see that, workers lived in terrible conditions, that wasn't a very nice way for people to live. But their solution was to appeal to capitalists to say, you've got to help these workers, you've got to intervene to help them, change society on their behalf. But Marx said something different. He talked about workers needing to, self-emancipation. Not something that's achieved by a well-meaning person on their behalf, or not something that's, brought down from the top of society and handed down. Because the working class does all the work in society. The houses don't get built, the food doesn't get produced, the trains don't get driven, the post doesn't get delivered without working class people. And they're brought together in big workplaces. That means they have a shared experience of being exploited, and they can organize and they can fight together. And they have. History has shown us this, right? The history of capitalism contains a big history of class struggle against oppression. And that's what we mean by the grave diggers of capitalism. Capitalism has been exploited, been exported around the world. As it's done so, it's created an enormous working class of over 2 billion people. It was only a few million in Marx's time. And that means that, they have more power than ever before. Their position in society, creating all the wealth, concentrated together, means we have the potential to overturn and completely transform society through our own collective struggle. And because we work collectively, when we take over the workplaces, we can run them under democratic control and in our own interests. And as I said, this means revolutionary change. Marx was clear that to get rid of capitalism, it would take a revolution, right? It was very, very clear about this. He was a revolutionary, actually devoted his life as well to the study of capitalism, but also to activism, to politics as well. His project was the complete transformation of society. And by revolution, I don't mean like a small group of us, getting together, storming down to Downing Street or Parliament together, although, that does kind of sound fun. A revolution is a mass event, right? Drawing in millions of people. And we're talking about a thoroughgoing transformation of society. So we're not just talking about getting rid of a couple of people at the top, we're getting rid of everyone at the top, and run society from the bottom up more equitably and more fairly. So Marx didn't lay down a blueprint for what socialism would look like, right? This is working class self-emancipation. It will be created by the people who fight for it. Communism, socialism will be created by the people who fight for it out of the process of revolution and not imposed according to a plan. But to be clear, socialism would mean, at a minimum, the abolition of class society, the abolition of private property, and the means of production, the things that we need to survive will be owned in common by everyone, and we'll all decide how they'll be used best. So we can introduce again some human control over the way that our society is organized, our lives and our futures. That's very, very, very important. So we have to say, just socialism is not just limited to getting a different party elected in government, or not just limited to laws that are passed in Parliament. We're talking about a total upheaval, changing things from top to bottom. And in the last 200 years, since Marx's time, struggles and revolutions have broken out in some country or another in every decade from then until now. The experience of exploitation, of crisis, of oppression, of war, inherent to capitalism pushes people to fight back. We've seen this time and time and again. The frenzy drives for profits. It actually intensifies exploitation, competition and war, and it causes resentment in the mass of people. This is inevitable. Crisis is inevitable, and therefore struggle is inevitable. But what isn't inevitable is the victory of our side, right? The victory of our side in the establishment of a socialist society. This is a political project. This is a subjective element. And the revolutionary process throws up very many important questions about how the way forward, how do we overcome the state? For Marxists, the state is not a neutral entity. It emerges to protect the rule of capitalists, the police, the army, etc. So overcoming the state is a very big question, and that means we need a revolutionary party that's embedded in made up of working class people, that's in every workplace, every campus, every community, that are one to Marxist ideas, not just about getting rid of a couple of people at the top, but about getting rid of all of them. Don't just stop at getting rid of the Tories, although that would be a very good start, but take on every rotten expression of the system. Thank you. And generalize the best lessons to push things forward. So yeah, we want to argue against those who say, we've got rid of one person at the top, and so we can just stop there. No, we want to push forward until we've got rid of them all. And I think this is why Marx spent so much time as an activist, trying to win more people to this project. He was always involved in organization to win people to ideas. So I know that Marx is a popular figure in academia, but he never hid the fact he was a revolutionary. This was never a secret for him. And just to finish, another quote from Marx, the concluding sentences from the Communist Manifesto, they state very plainly, communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their change. We have a world to win. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Jess, for a fascinating talk to kick us off. What we're going to do, we'll take contributions and questions shortly, but I'm going to ask you to speak to your neighbour for 2 to 3 minutes to kind of get conversation going, and then I'll bring you back to the room. Comrades, thank you so much. Okay, thanks so much. So I hope you've started to kind of get your ideas together. So what we're going to do, we can ask contributions, questions. I'll time you for about 3 minutes per contribution. After 2 minutes, I'll say to you, you've got 1 minute left. After that, I'll start saying, can you sum up? And if you don't do that, then I'll start saying sum up a bit louder, probably. So who'd like to kick us off? Yeah, the comrade up there.
I'm not, any sort of social scientist, but this is all new to me. But it strikes me that the analysis initially of Marx in terms of the explanations, historical materialism, explanations for the structure of science, of society, that strikes me as being so right on the nose, it's just, and all the things you're saying about it being a crisis, leading inevitably to crisis, like being part of the structure of the system. But what I'm less sure about is, if you like, the solution. I mean, at one point you were saying, revolution, that would be, could work, but get rid of everyone at the top and replace this, which I would love to see replaced, with a democratic system. So you just touched on that. You said, replace them all and make it democratic and get rid of everyone at the top. And I'm just wondering what would that lead to in turn? Because in all the other systems, feudal and mercantilism and all that lark, there was always people at the top. So to get rid of them in such a way they stay got rid of.
That's a very good.
That's just my naive question.
Thank you very much, and thanks for starting us off. If you want to raise your hand, just keep up so I can catch you. I might not see you immediately. I'll take the comrade at the back in the green top. Yourself?
Yeah, no, just that, following on sort of what this gentleman said here, you think in this country, like it's all very well you're saying that we need a total revolution to overhaul the whole system and remove all the bureaucratic people at the top of society. But how how do you suppose that, because generally in this country, not enough of the population is A, angry enough, and B, sort of left-wing enough to want a revolution and to enact change? How do you suggest that people go about trying to get people to move and change things?
Thank you very much. I'm not even having to tell people to sum up. This is fantastic. Comrade up the back.
Just a couple of things, like in terms of historical materialism. I mean, so all those 50 stages, I'm just wondering, like that, about the future. You know, like sometimes we talk about, you know, 7th centuries thing, we cannot use it anymore. So I'm just wondering that whether, you know, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, whether AI will play a big role, whether, you know, like AI can be actually revolutionary and change the world forever. So like, instead of like everyone being poor, everyone can be a millionaire. So it's a kind of socialism, it's a like kind of luxury socialism, whether that can be a kind of, you know, future scenario, you can say.
Thank you. Welcome, comrades. You make this really easy for us. It's fantastic. Yeah, we're going to have down in front.
I know you talked about revolution from the left, but I think one of the problems at the moment is a revolution coming also from the right. There's such an increase in separate nationalism that you're seeing both in, well, everywhere. You're seeing with Marine Le Pen, for instance, in France. What I really want to know is, you've got these two groups. You've got a group on the far left coming up. You've got a group on the far right. This sort of dialectic clash of ideas. How is that going to pan out in the future? Because obviously it's getting more and more prevalent with the rise in exploitation.
Thank you.
The explanation was very helpful, though I sense there was an element of a religion rather than a science, because it is expecting human nature to behave in a way that patently it doesn't. And I think the problem is most situations, there's a clique that rises to the top, even if there wasn't one to begin with. If you look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, if you term it, the Chinese Revolution, each of them actually resulted in a whole load more bloody conflict after it had actually taken hold. So instead of actually avoiding conflict, those situations have created conflict. And in effect, they have ended up creating very structured organizations which have not been equally, have not distributed wealth equally. I think there's a role for psychology to play here to work out what it is, how you can actually get humans to behave in a way that it's going to work. There have been methods using planned economies, and the idea of using AI might be to automate, say, financial services, so that intermediation through systems could take out the greed and distribute things in a much fairer sense. But still, you have a problem that those who design the plan will inevitably influence it, and it may have limitations.
Thank you very much. Comrade here.
Well, thank you very much for the lovely explanation. And I think, I mean, the reflection that comes to me, and I think it's hovering around all the humanity is right. The solution is to remove the whole system, but why that's not happening, why it's so difficult to make it happen. And what came to me, the impression is that a lot of things changed since within 2023, and since the capitalism decided to use the divide and conquer practice over the workers to take control them and block the organization of the masses, right? So mass media and consumerism are instruments that now in 23 are the main tools. Because you said, Marx, you quoted Marx saying the proletarians have nothing to lose, not to gain. Unfortunately, the perception nowadays is not the same anymore, because proletarians now and working class now told the fact that they have Netflix, YouTube, Apple, and the whole list for the whole day. And these are all things that are sold to them, but they're scared to lose if a revolution would happen and they would crash the Apple store, right? So I think the culture and the media and the information is the key to get back to make the revolutionary plan real. So events like this should happen at every corner of every city, every weekend for a few years. And maybe people would throw away smartphones and start back reading something. And that would be the start.
Thank you very much. Also, if you do want to make a contribution, I'm getting quite a lot of names now, so I'll try and fit you in as soon as possible. Yep, the comrades. Yeah, sorry, did you have your hand up as well?
Okay.
Comrade in the white, and then I'll come back to you.
Oh, you want to get am I right in thinking, you know, when you say, yeah, obviously we want to get rid of people at the top, like leading bosses, but do you mean sort of more about giving the power to the workers, controlling the workplace, like, for example, the docks in the 70s, like the unions and the workers controlled that, and distributing the wealth more to them. And a couple of other people also have asked about how we're going to change, how we're going to convince people to change and be revolutionary. But I think that's quite important because our children are now being brought up in a capitalist society, and that is all they know as they're going through this education. So, you know, it is quite important that we do have these things. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And over here.
I mean, I think that comrades have raised lots of really important questions, but I wanted to come back to the comrade who raised the question that isn't Marxism more a religion than a science? And I think that really the importance of what Jess said is that Marxism is a method, a way of looking at the world, and it helps us analyze what is going on. And Jess quoted, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. That gives us an insight. I read those words rather a little more time than I care to remember, but it was a blinding light to me, because it means to say that when you go out of here, you look around the buildings, you look at what people are doing, and we all know that the class division is absolutely massive. But if we left it just at that, then we've got a good analysis. But the question is, what do we do about it? And that's the question, I think, of the comrade who raised it at the back. You know, how do we persuade people? And the great thing about Marxism is that it's dynamic. So you go on to a picket line where workers have quite perhaps a limited view of what they can achieve. They then get bashed over the head by the police, and they suddenly realize it's not just a strike, it's a system. But they only come to that conclusion if there are also socialists on the picket line in the strike who are saying that's right, and we now need to band together to fight the capitalists. So the great thing about Marxism is that it is a guide to action based not on religion, but on an analysis that really is so blindingly obvious that often we ignore it, because it's everywhere. Oh, very good.
Sorry, I'll come back to yourself. I missed you.
Yeah, I was just in response to people raising, I think, what was it, fully automated luxury space communism. Yeah, the idea that the answer lays in AI and all these new technologies that we have. The issue that I always think of in those is that it seems like it's this very Western, not taking imperialism into account approach. Where is the lithium for those fully automated spaceships coming from? I think it's this turning to these new technologies to save us without sort of going into the roots of where the actual issues are and concluding just paper over it. And so while I think sort of AI and future technologies, of course, have a massive role in all approaches, I think there's often this kind of fallacy kind of using it to paper over everything and ignoring the fact that the resources to fill those things, the problem remains the same.
Thank you very much. So, comment here?
Yes. That's something and the others. My first question is, I want to ask the question, you speak too much, but you didn't say the effect of unions. As an assistant lecturer in academia, I do not have right to act because I am hourly paid worker. But on the other side, the other academics, which is who has the permanent contract in academia, they are going to, I'm seeing their stories in Instagram, they are striking by being holiday in Spain or Italy. What kind of strike is this? What kind of act is this? Again, the capitalist accumulation. This is the first thing, and I'm saying the unions are also neoliberalized. The members are not going due to the membership fees, the loss of instructions that they have to do to be a member of the union. People are not referring to their union member nowadays. My PhD project is focusing on and directly asking my interviewees why you are not a member. They are advising these things. And the another thing is, as you say, capitalism is in the all corner of the planet. The thing that I realized because of my PhD project, I'm saying the capitalist accumulation is sitting a side chair in the houses. Because we are just thinking that people are working outside, but nowadays, with thanks of the AI or digital technologies, people are working from their kitchens, their bedrooms. And one of my interviewees say, I'm waking up and I'm seeing there is no way, there is no place to go out. I'm just waking up, sitting on my bed and working for a company. The capitalist accumulation is accumulating people by using digital sovereignty in their bedroom. And this is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully, I know people have put their hands up there, but I'll hopefully get you all in comments here. So on you go.
My first time talking and it's kind of new to this. So forgive me if this is a bit of an ignorant question. So you mentioned earlier about workers owning the means of production in factories and then work. How would that work practically? Like,
Thank you. Coincidentally, I'm actually coming to you next.
Firstly, a lot of thanks for the opportunity and for this organization. I'm from Germany, and after 16 years of a conservative party, we now have a social democratic chancellor. My question is it in his power to change the system fundamentally? Thanks.
Through.
Okay, I'm actually more people on here. That's great. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Just to respond to comrade here, I'm also in academia and I totally understand the sentiment that we have been on this 4 fights regarding pay equality, gender equality, instilling, and we're taking part in what is action short of strike. And certain universities, I just want the room to know, certain universities have taken a very punitive action, including one of my own, where they're taking away 100% of our pay just for not marking our scripts, which is action short of strike. And I do completely sympathize with the fact that when you see some colleagues posting pictures on Instagram where they're holidaying away, it does give you a bit of pain. But I think the answer still remains in continuing the fight on and fighting on. They are threatening to starve us. We have declared an indefinite strike, which means we won't be paid until indefinite, until that's fine. But it's our labor and it's our right to withdraw the labor, and withdraw we shall, unless we are heard.
Comment here from.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And I just wanted to come back on this idea of, is there always somebody at the top? Because I think we should remember that for 90% of human history, there was no one at the top. These were non-class societies, hunter-gatherer societies. And that's quite important because they were societies that were egalitarian, they had no hierarchy. I mean, they were quite basic, lived hand to mouth, but it shows that human nature isn't fixed. There always has to be someone at the top. And actually Engels, who worked with Marx, looked at these a lot to see what changed and why class societies did come about after living in these societies for so many years. I mean, and I think that's important because you can see as well why there's a development of class society. Because out of these basic societies, changes happen, there begins to be a bit of extra produced, an extra surplus in society over and above the means of immediate subsistence. And classes develop about who controls that extra. And this takes place over thousands of years, and obviously capitalism is a new form of class society. But actually, capitalism is quite unique in the sense it now produces enough for everybody in that way. And one of the things I wanted to bring in, though, is about how Marx, when you think about how change happens, he is actually learning from struggles that are going on whilst he's writing. And one of them that's really important is in 1871, it's called the Paris Commune. And this is when workers, the people of Paris, literally take over running Paris themselves. I think it's something like 8 weeks. And the police and the army and all the rulers, they go to Versailles because they're so scared. And people run it directly. And they have mass meetings of thousands in the neighbourhoods every evening. They decide who's going to do what. Those people go and do it. If they don't, they get, they're directly accountable. There's a deeper democracy. And Marx learns about the states because actually the state regroups and smashes that. But he gets a glimpse of how people could run things differently themselves without classes and without people at the top. And I think when we talk about revolution today, it's not separate to the struggles happening today. I mean, people talk about strike action. We've had the biggest number of strikes for 30 years in Britain in the last year. Fantastic. I think those sort of strikes on a much bigger scale, involving more people, that's how revolutionary situations begin to develop. Because if you're on strike, and imagine all the workers on strike and occupying workplaces, things have to happen in society still. We still have to eat, we still need healthcare, we still need education. Except what you can learn from history, which is what Marx was doing, we've seen it since, is workers start running it for themselves, not for profit. Okay, we do need healthcare, but we're not going to be told what to do by those managers. We will provide it ourselves. We do need food, we're going to make it, right? But we're not doing it for profit, so the boss will provide it to people. And this actually throws up new forms of self-organisation. We saw them at its height in the Russian Revolution, they were called the Soviets, of workers themselves in new democratic ways running society. And that creates a revolutionary situation that out of which you can see a glimpse to something new. And that's what we're fighting for, and that's why it matters. Out of the struggles today, if they go forward and win, that actually makes us stronger to think we could win more and things go forward in a bigger way. But I think I picked my 3 minutes. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. Comrades up the back. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in any discussion about Marxism, eventually somebody does talk about, but you haven't thought of human nature. I think Marx thought very deeply about it, and I think the key point is it's not fixed. It's historically conditioned. It changes and develops. The key point is that the working class under capitalism is quite unique in its capacity. First of all, it's collective. Work does not take place just on individual plots of land, fragmented forms. It takes place in vast workplaces. It's interdependent with global supply chains. And secondly, the capitalists tie workers to more and more technology. But that means that workers are, working class is the first oppressed and exploited class in history that predominantly is literate, for example. It has enormous capacity to democratically run work. Why should a hospital just be run? Well, it's not even run by the consultants, it's run by accountants that look at profit and loss. Why shouldn't it be run by all of the people who work there? Why shouldn't a school? Why shouldn't a factory? And so on. If you take over Tesco's tomorrow, the workers storm it. It doesn't make sense to break it all up into a little piece of land or something. You have to run it collectively. So there's a new sense of human capacity that workers have been enabled with. And the argument about, like, if we win, if we take control, won't somebody else just come to the top? And it seems to me, my argument is it would clearly be in the interests of workers to run things collectively. Once we've taken control, why the hell would we hand it back? Why would we allow someone else to take control? It's in our interest to run it collectively. And the point is that someone said, are people angry enough? Honestly, people are angry in Britain. What there's not always is a sense of power, of capacity, or who to blame and where to focus. And I don't believe revolutions happen when everybody simultaneously becomes left-wing. Revolutions happen because things are intolerable. People fight back, and then millions of people discover that left-wing ideas, like the ones that Jess outlined, suddenly fit their reality. So I think we're heading into more struggles. The key isn't, will there be struggle? The key actually isn't, will there be a revolution? It'll be, will we win? And that depends on human organisation, on building political parties, on having arguments with the people around us. It's an active participatory sport. Get involved.
I do have time for one more short contribution. Hand was set straight away. On you go.
I think a lot of people were talking about AI earlier. I don't think it can come from AI. The people who have and are building AI, they have intrinsic biases. They have things that they put into AI. It's got to come from us. I was in a march in October calling for a general strike. I was up there. I was holding that placard for the Socialist Workers' Party. It's got to come from us. AI doesn't have the passion. AI doesn't have the fire to run a society run by workers. It's got to be us. It's got to be us rising up to do it. Because if it's not us, who is it going to be? AI created by the bourgeoisie, created by the capitalists. It's just going to be the same. If we bow to a godlike AI, they control the money, they control the funding. If we really want to be a Marxist society, that means equality, not bowing to an AI. That means passion, that means drive, and that means a revolution coming from us, the workers, the proletariat, not the bourgeoisie. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. What's been a fantastic start to Marxism, I'd say. What I'll say is, if Jess hasn't convinced you already to join a revolutionary organisation like the Socialist Work Party, and if that contribution can convince you to join a revolutionary socialist organisation, then you can come speak to myself or Amy, who'll be standing at the membership stand after the meeting. Just a couple of announcements before I bring Jess back in to sum up. The opening rally will be kicking off at 7 p.m. We'll be joined by Chris Smalls, who's been the person unionising the Amazon workers in America, the human rights campaign lawyer Amar Anwar from Scotland, thankfully, so a familiar accent, the Justice campaigner Masir Rig, and many more. This is going to start at 7 in the Friends Meetings House, which is about a 5 to 10 minute walk away, so please try to get there in time. Secondly, if you have any left luggage in the luggage room, please get it before the open rally, because you won't be able to get it after. Yes, books. If you have not been to Bookmarks already, down at the atrium in this building, there's a huge bookstall, a huge bookshop, I should say, not stall, because there's about 50 million stalls, where you can buy any books. We have some publications that are related to this topic, and you can get many, many more. So 10 minutes, Jess? Maybe 10 minutes.
I'll do my best. Well, I was going to start talking about AI to begin with, but I don't know if I'm going to top that. So I might just no, I think it's an important question, because there are some strands, aren't there? You think about fully automated luxury communism. This is the book by Aaron Bastani, Novara Media. It's the idea that basically technological advances will eventually create such a what's the word? A bounty, I guess, for us all, for like inequality to be done. We can all just have robots creating everything we need for us. There's no need to work anymore. And I think it's just laughable, actually, because if you see the way that technological advances have been historically used, they historically used to drive, to drive productivity, haven't they? Like to drive productivity. So advances in technology, if you think about, if you think about the like checkouts, now you have to kind of do them themselves. You don't have one person operating them anymore. Instead of, that's great that someone doesn't have to do that job anymore. It's kind of like it's not a very interesting job. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we just have robots doing that instead? But what happens is, all the people that were the checkout people, they've lost their jobs. And now there's one person running 10 of them instead of the rest of it. So far from technology actually being driven by like the rest of it, being driven to end inequality or to create a more for the rest of us. They're actually technological advancement is being driven to drive profits, to drive increased profits like the rest of it. And I very much agree. Like what's missing under capitalism is that we don't actually have control over the way that we decide how we produce things in our society. And I think that's something that we want to regain, not something that we want to hand off to technologies. So if you think about the climate crisis again, or if you think about the rest of it, we really want to be able to, as a society, think about what we're producing, how we're producing it, and produce it for everyone, based on human needs, not on the needs of those at the top. Okay, so how do you keep the ruling class gone? I think it's been answered quite well, but I think there's a myth, isn't there, that communism means less democracy, that it means dictatorships, brutal dictatorships like we saw in Stalinist Russia, like the rest of it. But what I think, you know, what we're trying to do in this meeting is reclaim the idea that communism socialism, communism would actually be about a vast deepening of democracy. I don't think we live in a very democratic society at the moment. I think, you know, our version of democracy is, you know, you go to the ballot box every 3 years, tick a box, and that's what it's supposed to be in a democratic society, choosing between, you know, one group of people who are, you know, exploiting you, repressing you, bringing in new laws, and another group of them. So I think we want to deepen that. And really, it's this idea, isn't it, that like politics, that economics, what happens in work, or what happens in, you know, what happens in the economic sphere is separate from politics. We don't get to vote on who our boss is. We don't get to vote on what happens in our workplaces. Why not? This is the vast majority of our, like, what makes up our society, isn't it? This is what makes up our lives. Why can't we vote on, you know, how many houses we have, how many houses we have, who lives in them, all the rest of it? What we're talking about, a socialist society, is about having much more democracy. So I think that's right. What Amy talked about. And actually the question about, like, how would it work, direct, the comrade over here, kind of direct democracy and people taking over workplaces. We've seen kind of kernels of this that have emerged in revolutionary situations. Amy talked about in the Russian Revolution and in the Paris Commune. So workers, when they're, you know, workers do all the work in society. We don't actually need the people at the top in order to produce the things we need. So the things called Soviets developed in the Russian Revolution. They've had other names and other things, but they're these flowering kind of democratic bodies that kind of were brought up as workers, took over, you know, they struck, they occupied, they took over the factories, and they would have councils and mass meetings of, like, everyone in the workplace to vote and decide on what happened during the revolution. And, or, you know, we need to organize food. There's been a general strike for 2 weeks. We need to make sure everyone's being fed. We're talking about, like, yeah, direct control over what's been happening. Okay, so how do we get people to do a revolution? Are people angry enough? I very much agree that people are angry enough. I talked about the system breeds crisis, right? It cannot escape it. It is a crisis-ridden system. We're living through a huge crisis at the moment in this country. You know, there's millions of children living in poverty in this country, and it's the 5th richest country in the world. That is a crisis, and people are angry, and we are seeing people fighting back. The cost of living crisis has driven the biggest uptick in workers' struggle that we've seen in 30 years. No, we want to see it much deeper, much wider, and you know, there's all kinds of very, you know, that actually me and Mark are launching a book about the strikes on Sunday in the middle of the day. People should come to that, The Revival of the Resistant. Oh, okay, yeah. So people should come to that for a bigger discussion about the strikes and where they're going. But basically, capitalism historically breeds crisis and breeds revolutionary situations, and we can't escape that. And I think the crisis that we're seeing right now, and I think your question was a very good one, about revolution to the right and how do we make sure the right doesn't, because I think crisis breeds polarization, right? There's you know, that people can be one to left-wing ideas, but there's no guarantee there can be one to left-wing ideas. There's, you know, there could be one to right-wing ideas, and we see the growth, haven't we, of the far right across Europe, you know, people being one to right-wing ideas, the Tories being much more right-wing, and people being one to, you know, politics of despair instead of what we offer, which is the politics of hope and something different. So that's fundamentally a political project. So yeah, I think, yeah, to kind of bring this to a close, those kind of historical processes that we talked about, they're what we're talking about is like a big event. And in the last great kind of revolutionary period that we experienced, there was a revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, who talked about socialism or barbarism, right? There's a choice that happens when we're in a crisis of this scale. You know, if you think about the period just after World War I, when we saw this great revolutionary moment, revolution in Russia, across Europe, talked about socialism or barbarism. Like, we either fight for a completely different society, or things will grow into barbarism. If you think about the horrors of the Holocaust, if you think about you know what happened, you know, World War II, if you think about, you can see how right she was. The fact that revolutionary movement wasn't able to break through meant that there was, you know, a great amount of suffering. bloody conflict on a scale that we've never seen before. World War I was the most bloody conflict that the world had seen up until World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust. So, the idea that it's communism that breeds conflict and war and bloodshed is laughable, I think. But I think that means that the stakes are very, very high. We are, I think, entering a period of catastrophic climate change. We're entering into a period of increased inter-imperialist rivalries. You can see what's happening in the Ukraine, the risk of nuclear war, the growing imperialist rivalries between the US and China. You can see the dangers, haven't you? And then of course the economic crisis, which is bearing down on all of us, which they have no solutions for. The people at the top have no solutions for the economic crisis except to punish us, except to press down on working class living standards. So I think we have a very, very, a big task for our hands. And I think, as I've said, it's very much a political project. Us in the Socialist Workers' Party, we are a revolutionary party. We think that the scale of the crisis means it requires revolutionary change from the bottom to the top. And we want you to join us in that project. And not only, come and sign the form, but get involved. We need more socialists who are involved in all the strikes, who are arguing for, let's not just stop the strikes when we've, got 4 or 5%, let's keep pushing. We need to all strike together. We need socialists in every workplace, in every campus, not just for the struggles that we'll see in the next year or so, but for the bigger project of revolutionary change from the bottom to the top. So if you're not a member, come and fill out a form. But as I've said, get involved and let's fight for a better world.